Welcome to It's Our Money with Ellen Brown, a look behind the curtain of global finance and monetary control with one of the foremost experts in the field. Author of the bestseller Web of Debt and the Public Bank Solution, Ellen Brown's groundbreaking work began the movement to create new American public banks. We'll look at issues surrounding the world of money and the systems and powers that control it, as well as the progress being made on the public banking frontier. The program is underwritten by Public Banking Associates, a national consultancy of experts advising government leaders pursuing the creation of their own public banks at publicbankingassociates.com.
What we need is a political movement, a powerful movement in this country of the kind that we've seen in social movements in the past that are going to demand that we bring the principles of democracy, which were at the bedrock of our government, and extend them into the economy itself. But without that kind of push and that movement, which has to begin in the grassroots level, it begins in cities and so forth, that we're never going to have enough clout to actually win the battle that needs to happen at the federal level. We're in a kind of battle for the soul of America. We need to start a kind of revolutionary spirit around the question of ownership of America and its economy.
That's Ted Howard, co-founder of the Democracy Collaborative and co-author of a new book that raises the fundamental challenge to us all about whether democracy will control our nation's future and common interests, or private capital. Right now, private financial interests have captured our government's regulatory and congressional powers, and the resulting outcomes are tearing away at the social fabric and economic vitality of our country. Hello, and welcome once again to It's Our Money with Ellen Brown. I'm Walt McCree, Ellen's co-host and senior advisor to the Public Banking Institute. Today we're going to investigate some of the underlying components of how our economy has gotten off track over the past several decades, which has left the majority of American citizens by the wayside of security and promise. We're all familiar with the term economic inequality, which speaks to the systemic reasons why so many of us are left out of the benefits and abundance of the world's richest economy. Ted Howard will talk about these factors with Ellen and what we must do to recover democratic control of our economy. And in a minute, we'll talk with Ellen about how far behind we are in the U.S. relative to our peers in the global economy and why. Our current struggles in this regard resemble those of the prairie farmers of North Dakota 100 years ago, who, in the face of remarkably similar economic circumstances, gathered the courage and took a stand to protect their interests in a bold step that transformed their state economy. The centenary anniversary of the Bank of North Dakota is July 28th, and we'll hear from Mike Jacobs, state historian and journalist, who shares some brief insights into how this anniversary got started. It's a helpful narrative about what it will take for today's American citizens to reclaim their economic power. But before we delve into all that, let's talk with Ellen about her recent articles that compare the economic impacts of economies that use their banks to stimulate dramatic economic growth and social stability versus the exploitative debt system that burdens Americans.
Well, I've done 3 articles since our last chat, since we had summer off, as you said. So the first one was about why is it that 90% of Chinese can afford their own homes, and they're like 80%, 100% owned, whereas for us, a much smaller percentage of the population owns their own home, and even then they don't really own it. It's pretty much owned by the banks. So theoretically, the Chinese are making much less money on average. So how can it be? The story we're told, or what we're led to believe, is that the reason that we have to impose sanctions on China is that they are unfairly propping up their corporations by cheap loans from their government banks. Well, I think we should do the same thing. That's not a bad idea at all. And because they're exploiting their very cheap labor. But if their labor is so cheap, how is it that they own their own homes? So that's what I was writing about. One reason, or a major reason, is that the government not only supports their companies, they also support their people. So they do this for education, for one thing. Education is very cheap the way it used to be, or higher education the way it used to be for us, like in the 60s when I was undergraduate. Most students get out of university with like no debt. I mean, it's so cheap they can just work their way through college with a part-time job, the way we used to be able to do.
You mentioned in that article about commentary by Noah Smith in Bloomberg News, which was a really telling comment. It said, Japan's long-ruling Liberal Democratic Party has figured out a novel and interesting way to stay in power. Govern pragmatically, focus on the economy, and give people what they want. He said that everyone who wanted a job had one. Small and mid-sized businesses were doing well, and the Bank of Japan's unprecedented program of monetary easing had provided easy credit for corporate restructuring without generating inflation. Abe had also vowed to make both preschool and college free. Well, that's what you're talking about, isn't it, really? Giving the people what they want because he's able to control or have direct input on the monetary policy of the country.
Right. But that's Japan. I was talking about China, actually, how the Chinese can afford their own homes. Yes, so that was my second article on modern monetary theory. And what our Green New Deal faction is promoting is that the monetary theory, which is that the government can spend more and it won't create hyperinflation like everybody thinks, and the debt is not that important. But what they're assuming is that the central bank will buy the debt. And in fact, in the U.S., under our existing laws, that's not true. That our central bank is independent. The Treasury is not allowed to sell the debt directly to the Fed and take an overdraft on their account with the Fed. So we really need to change the Federal Reserve Act. But that's not true in Japan and China. They have different banking laws. So in Japan, even though they their central banks purport to be independent, in Japan, their banking laws say that the Ministry of Finance, which is, the central government, is supposed to work with the central bank in order to form monetary and fiscal policy. So what they can do, and what Abe has done, their prime minister, in Abenomics, is working with the central bank where they have a deal ahead of time, where Abe says, okay, we're going to spend a lot of money to stimulate the economy, but you guys are going to buy it. And they agree to that. I mean, they have to come to agreement. It's not like Abe rules. But in China, the central bank, or the central government actually does rule, and the central bank is, under their laws, actually working for the central government. So the central government can just say, you're going to fund this high-speed rail that we're going to build. So the central government just decides to do something. In fact, they don't even have to go to their central bank because they own 80% of the banks. So they can just go to their other banks and take out a loan for, let's say, high-speed rail. Of course, we now know that banks actually create the money they lend on their books. So the bank would just issue the money. The government would build the railroad. Then the proceeds from the trains would pay back the loan. And in China, for those loans that don't pay back, like people say, well, that's fine, but what about fixing the roads? That's not going to pay back, so that's just going to be a loss. In China, when they fund things and the loan doesn't pay back, they just carry it as non-performing loans on their books. And we in the West protest loudly that they've got all these non-performing loans and they have to do something about them. And economists are always saying that the Chinese economy is going to crash because of these non-performing loans. But as long as they carry them on the books, there's no problem. It's not money that was borrowed from someone that has to be paid back. It's money that was just created on the books. So they could carry those indefinitely, and it's not a problem. Or they could transfer them to the books of the central bank. And we saw how that worked out when the Federal Reserve transferred the toxic mortgage-backed securities of our big, actually bankrupt banks onto the Fed's books. They bought the toxic mortgage-backed securities with quantitative easing, and that worked out perfectly fine. It didn't crash the economy. It didn't go into hyperinflation. It didn't mean that we had a terrible debt, et cetera. So that worked.
So are we seeing here a contrast between the macro policy of our central banks, in which the mandates of governing for the public interest can get affected and realized through the Chinese and the Japanese model of central banking, whereas in the United States, the interests of the banks are preserved in our central bank model? Isn't that what we're seeing here, a dramatic difference between the outcomes of policy?
Yeah. Ben Bernanke was asked by President Obama when Bernanke was issuing all these essentially free loans to the big banks. President Obama said, couldn't you make interest-free loans to the state and local governments? They also are struggling. And what Ben Bernanke said was that he wasn't allowed to. It wasn't in the Federal Reserve Act. So we actually have to change the law, and we could change the law so that they can work together, so that the central bank can fund Congress's programs. And people think, well, then Congress will just spend too much, but it's working for China and Japan. And Congress is a big place. I mean, they're all checking each other. It's not, they still have to approve a budget. It's not like they're going to say, oh, great, now we have all this free money, we can do whatever we want. That everybody knows that if you create too much free money, you could create inflation. I mean, there are downsides to it. So it seems to me you've got plenty of checks and balances right there in Congress when they're forming a budget.
Well, it's kind of interesting, though. Congress, as has been said, is owned by the banks. Vic Durbin's famously quoted as saying that, and of course it's pretty apparent that there's a lot of truth in that. So one wonders, is it possible, or would it be possible for us to change the law in which we would have that kind of cooperation? We don't have that spirit of statesman-like commitment to public interest, it doesn't seem.
Yeah, well, that is our big problem. But now we have these very vocal millennials who they are the ones that have suffered from the banking crisis, and they are sort of without hope. You know, they're feeling crushed by the current system and their big student debts, et cetera. So that would be my goal, would be to alert them to they're very activist and they're out there and they're speaking. But they don't seem to realize at the moment that we actually have to change some laws in order to work with the central bank. I mean, the push right now, I guess, is to Congress to spend more, and Congress is just not going to go for that unless they have some other source of money besides hitting up, raising taxes or slashing services.
But it's clear, too, that there's a great deal of change in mindset about the debt and deficit considerations in budgeting. The likes of Rush Limbaugh saying that the whole idea has been bankrupt from the start. The deficit and the debt are concerns no longer. We can build the debt as we want. It really changed that landscape dramatically. So it seems like there's a lot of very serious reconsideration underway.
Yeah, things have happened suddenly before. If you get enough public momentum, it seems to me things could happen. Like in 1933, when Roosevelt took the dollar off the gold standard, people said he couldn't do it, but he did it, and it worked. And you just need the political will. Or when Ben Bernanke did $3.7 trillion in quantitative easing, people said, can he do that? But he did it, and it worked. So it seems to me if you had the political will, I mean, it's possible that this president, being sort of a free thinker himself, he could do something dramatic like that if he got the vision to do it, and could lean on the central bank or could lean on Congress to change the rules. But they do have to see the logic of it. They do have to see that it works. Japan and China have proven that it works, and China particularly is outpacing us. So if we want to keep up, we can't just do it by penalizing them or by going to war. We need to do it by actually competing, and to compete, we need a banking system that works for the people, for the economy.
And there's so many new developments around money, the management, payment systems, etc., in which the traditional banking regime is being challenged. Another one of your articles focuses on one of those developments, Facebook's so-called cryptocurrency, Trojan Rabbit, as it's been called by a zero-hedge commentator. The Libra development, in which Facebook would be issuing its own currency backed by private capital, is a huge huge challenge to the system that we've got, not to mention what's happening in Asia with the ruble and the yuan and Chinese, the whole networks of payment systems developing in East Asia away from the dollar. In this article, you quote Nouriel Roubini saying that Libra will start out as a private, permissioned, non-trustless, centralized, oligarchy-driven, members-only club. So it's not blockchain, it's not secured, it's blockchain only in name, and it is a monopoly waiting to extract massive seigniorage from billions of users. A monopoly scam, he calls it. Tell us about Libra and how you think that's going to survive all of the challenges that it presents.
Right, or how we're going to survive. Libra is, it's Facebook's currency, and Facebook is huge globally. What they're trying to imitate is Alipay and WeChat Pay in China, which are also huge and are definitely threatening the banks because they're taking it over as a payment system. But Libra is going to be supposedly a cryptocurrency. It's not really a cryptocurrency. I mean, it's not that crypto. But you will be taking your dollars and buying these, unlike with WeChat Pay and Alipay, which are just basic payment systems, kind of like PayPal. You'll be taking your dollars and buying these coins, these digital coins, and your dollars will be gone. All you're going to have are these digital coins, and the dollars will be invested by the investors, and they're the ones that are going to be making money off this huge pool of money they're going to get out of the deal. And the investors are Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Uber, things like that. They have to put up $10 million to be one of the founding members. So these are big companies that are investing in it, and you would think these are the competitors of Libra. So why exactly are they investing in it? Libra is founded in Switzerland. So even though, for example, Nancy Pelosi said we've got to investigate this before they proceed, we can ask, but we don't really have any control over it because it's actually a Swiss organization. And most Facebook people are not even in the U.S. The majority are outside the country. So this could become a global alternative currency that does compete with the dollar, but it's going to be very risky. They're hoping that you will put your money in their Calibra exchange, that's how you'll get Libra, and they'll have a head start on everyone else. And, of course, Calibra will be advertised on Facebook, so everybody will probably use it. Calibra is just an exchange which will substitute for the central bank or for the banks. And if there's a run on Calibra, or if there's a hacking of Calibra, your money's just gone. There's no protection. You're not going to have a government behind you that you can go to get your money back. Even if let's say you just buy a product that you didn't really want, or that isn't what you thought you were getting, you can't go to Visa and MasterCard and challenge the charge and say, put a hold on this. It wasn't a fair deal or whatever. You can't challenge the stuff. A deal's a deal, and your money's gone. So it's very unsafe, but people are liable to go for it because it's billed as a cheaper way to transfer money globally. Although I don't even see that part, because you can now transfer money globally to friends and relatives for free on PayPal, for example, but maybe for big businesses it'll be cheaper, and certainly for the merchants it will be cheaper, and so that's why they may go for it.
Well, it is a kind of a frightening prospect insofar as it really destabilizes a system that, as you say, has the banking of common governance. But it is also a new cartel, a new money cartel controlled by private interests. So it's not a step forward in that sense, even though it might facilitate some transactional advantage. Very, very challenging times we're moving into here, Ellen, right? I mean, with the major new demands for infrastructure and for solving these problems that are coming down the line on a global basis, de-dollarization of what that's doing in politics around the nations of the world, separating the globe away from the dollar's hegemony. It's a very exciting time. And it's great to have you as a watch person on it, Ellen. So thanks for your articles. Let's keep them coming.
Okay, thank you. Great talking to you as always. it's my pleasure to be talking with Ted Howard, who is president and co-founder, along with Gar Alperovitz, of the Democracy Collaborative, and is the co-author of a new book just out called The Making of a Democratic Economy, which we'll be talking about here. The other author is Marjorie Kelly, who is also an executive at the Democracy Collaborative and has written other books, including one with the provocative title, The Divine Right of Capital, which we'll also be talking about. So Ted, it's great to have a chance to hear your views on this most interesting of subjects, how we can bring about a democratic economic revolution. So great to be talking to you. That's also a hot topic at the Public Banking Institute. We can talk till the cows come home on economic theory and what should be done, but the bigger challenge is how do we bring that about? But first, I wondered if you'd tell us a bit about the Democracy Collaborative itself and how it got started and what its goals are and what inspired you to write this book.
Well, thank you very much, Ellen, and let me just begin by saying how pleased I am to be on with you, because you and the public banking community are some of the most important elements in building a democratic economy, in my view. The Democracy Collaborative, well, we're almost 20 years old. It's hard to believe, and we began actually in the academy in a university at the University of Maryland at College Park, but always with the intention that we would spin out into our own independent organization, which we've been for some time. And the focus of our work really is around the fundamental transformation, if you will, of our political economy. You know, we live in a system, and that system is called global capitalism. And when you're inside a system, as we are, and as people have been throughout human history, it's always hard to imagine that there's something beyond what you're familiar with. So I suspect if we look back 3,000 years ago to Pharaoh's Egypt, people there were just absolutely certain there'd be pyramids and pharaohs and sphinxes and peasants and serfs, and that would go on forever. And of course now we study the Egypt of that period in our history books and at places like the British Museum. And similarly in the Middle Ages, I'm sure people always thought there'd be the nobility and the church and the peasants, and then that was swept away. And we think that there are a lot of reasons to believe that the kind of hyper corporate capitalism that we live under, it's actually, while it's the dominant system, there are many, many contradictions that it's unable to deal with, like climate change, like growing wealth inequality. In fact, these are outcomes of the system. So our interest is, how do you construct a vision of a democratic economy as opposed to the extractive, hyper corporate capitalism economy we have, and what does that look like in real terms? And what this book's about is that in fact, this new economy, this new democratic economy, is actually being born even as we speak. It's just not widely known yet and recognized, and we hope that the book will help shine a light on this movement toward a new, more democratic economy.
Yeah, I agree that 2008-2009 crisis has focused everybody on the fact that the current system simply isn't working, and people all over the world are looking for alternatives. I mean, there are little revolutions going on everywhere. I always think about when Roosevelt took the dollar off the gold standard, and people said, they said, can they do that? We can't do that. It can't be done. And it was done, and it worked out quite well. I mean, it was a whole new way of looking at money. So, yeah, that's what you focused on, and that's great. You mentioned about the problem being the financialization of the economy. That term is used a lot, but what exactly does that mean, and how did that happen? Where did we go wrong?
Well, the system of capitalism has been around a very long time, but something really dramatic happened in the late 70s and particularly in the 80s, and it was really new movements for a new kind of capitalism, a kind of financial capitalism in some ways, that came out of Margaret Thatcher's England and Ronald Reagan's United States. And there was an effort to bring about what many call a kind of neoliberal agenda in the economy, where there's a decided attempt to get rid of the role of government, to deregulate everything as much as possible, to push back against the unions, particularly in the United Kingdom, but also here in the United States. And what resulted was very large, powerful financial interests with very little countervailing power against them. You know, in the 20th century in the United States, capital, large corporations and the investors who own them, you know, it's very, very strong. It's a very powerful force. And organized labor was one of the elements that helped constrain the power of capital and brought about workers' rights and you know, many of the other things that we really appreciate. The problem has been that organized labor in the United States peaked in the 1950s and early 60s in terms of the amount of people unionized in the United States, something like 35% in the private sector, and today it's down to 6%. And so you've got sort of rampant hyper-capital advancing and moving forward, and very little countervailing against that. And that's why, for instance, you know, President Trump is every day touting this is the greatest economy in the history of the world. The stock market's off the charts, and it is, of course, and gross domestic product is up. But since the Great Recession and the financial crisis of a decade ago, 95% of all the income gains in this last decade have gone to the 1%. It's, you know, Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, says we have an economy of, by, and for the 1%. 3 people in America that everyone listening to this will have heard the names of, Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, own more wealth than the bottom 160 million Americans. So this concentration of wealth and power in fewer hands is escalating very rapidly, and what's happening is not only are the poor being left behind, but the working class and the middle class being hollowed out. And that's the effect of runaway capital, where we argue, Marjorie Kelly, my co-author, and I argue that we have in our economic system a capital bias, that the whole system is oriented to the power and the rights of capital and its owners, and in effect disregards the needs and the work of average working Americans who make this economy work.
Right. I do wonder where we went wrong, though. I mean, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights say that all men are created equal, that we're endowed by our creators with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But today we're at the point where most people, or a large percentage of the people, are reduced to slave laborers, even though that we have political freedom. We have the freedom to vote, but we don't have the ability really to create the sort of abundance that we would associate with happiness. You point out in your book that corporations didn't exist, or it was before the Industrial Revolution when the Constitution was passed, when corporations didn't exist. So the whole corporate model is something, corporate ownership is something that they obviously didn't even envision, and that was 200 years ago. So we need some new legislation, it seems to me. I mean, you talk a lot about we need to do it at the local level, and I totally agree with that too. But we also need, and you also say, we need the big changes at the top, big system changes, something like an economic Bill of Rights of the sort that Franklin Roosevelt attempted to get passed in the 1940s. But of course, he didn't. It failed, and it's been tried since, and it's failed. So what do you recommend? Like, how would you propose actually making change at the federal level?
Well, that's what we used to say, the $64,000 question. I'm showing how old I am. That's a rounding error from some of the very wealthy plutocrats these days, for like a second of work. You know, the problem is that while the ideology that we hear about from the conservative forces and this sort of neoliberalism is that government is the problem, we need to get out of the way. In fact, what's happened is these large, powerful, concentrated corporate and capital interests have captured government completely. So it's not that they got out of the way, they've captured it and are using it for their own ends. given this situation, I used to work a long time ago when I was a young man in the United States Senate for a senator from California. And, I could tell you right now, given the impact of money in politics, given these powerful corporate interests, it is going to be virtually impossible to address the problem we have merely through electing a different person as president, and I'm all for that. Let me go on the record for that. Or trying to fight for some big ideas and bills in the Congress, like the Green New Deal is a fantastic idea, but it is literally going to go nowhere. But it does provoke the imagination. I think what we need is a political movement, a powerful movement in this country of the kind that we've seen in social movements in the past that are going to demand that we bring the principles of democracy, which were at the bedrock of our government in the founding of this country, and extend them into the economy itself. But without that kind of push and that movement, which I think has to begin in the grassroots level, it begins in cities and so forth, that we're never going to have enough clout and enough power to actually win the battle that needs to happen at the federal level. But I completely agree with you that while I think a democratic economy is really built from the ground up, there needs to be, ultimately we need to accompany it by very powerful federal legislation, that looks at the power of the big financial institutions and says, what are we going to deal, how are we going to deal with these? That looks at the power of the oil and gas industry that literally stands in the way of anything truly constructive and transformative to deal with climate change in this country. So, in a way, not to be too dramatic, but I think we're at a time when we're in a kind of battle for the soul of America and who really owns America. And that's what we're trying to argue in this book, that we need to start to, if you will, a kind of revolutionary spirit around the question of ownership of America and its economy.
You discussed one solution that I think is brilliant, and it's actually something that is a good thing to be said about our corporate model, which is that we could actually just buy up these corporations. Like it used to be in the old-fashioned type of socialist revolution, you would have to, property was owned by landowners or big individual owners, and the property would be confiscated, or at least they would be forced to sell, like in the 1930s when gold owners were forced to sell their gold, which they didn't really want to do. But now we have a stock market where all that stuff is actually listed on the stock market. You don't have to force anyone to do anything. Yeah, you might have to do it in secret so that people wouldn't be jacking up the price knowing that the government was going to step in and buy stuff. But you could just buy up these corporations. Well, one would be banks, for example. Like when the next time we have a 2008 type crisis, I know Thomas Hanna's written about that we could just nationalize the banks. Just take them over, buy them up. But anyway, one thing you could do is just buy existing banks. And you mentioned buying up the oil companies that are getting in the way of any kind of regulation of fossil fuels. So you could do that without impinging on anyone's property rights, which is obviously a big deal in our current system. People wouldn't stand for just confiscating property. But then the question is where to find the money, and you've suggested quantitative easing, and you've called it quantitative easing for the planet. So I think that's great. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. People forget that 10 years ago during the financial crisis, the government of the United States and the Federal Reserve Bank, as well as the big national banks in Europe, deployed this strategy called quantitative easing, which literally it's creating money. It's the government's ability and the central bank's ability to create money essentially out of nothing. and at the time of the great financial crisis, the United States and the Federal Reserve Bank created about $3 trillion, $3.5 trillion that didn't previously exist, and used it to go in and take over and bail out the big banks and General Motors and AIG and so forth. And so there was a point in the last decade where we, the citizens and taxpayers of the United States, actually own these giant financial institutions and corporations through this quantitative easing process. And ultimately, as they got back to some stability and started to work again instead of collapsing, instead of keeping those assets as a kind of public trust for the country, the government just gave them back. So we're arguing in this book that we have a whole chapter on, as you say, quantitative easing for the planet. We've done a calculation that if we were simply to go out and buy up the fossil fuel companies that are in the way of any progress to be made on climate change in the United States, it would cost somewhere between $1 and $1.5 trillion simply to buy them up and own them nationally, nationalize them, and then strand those fossil fuels in the ground. Don't burn them. If we want to deal with climate change, that's the kind of systemic change we need. We actually need to strand this asset of fossil fuels in the ground and not burn it, and then, of course, make a transition at the same time to renewable energy and so forth. So you're quite right. There are strategies to advance these kinds of more democratic economic models that don't involve armed revolution. In a sense, using some of the tools of capitalism to take it on and get these people and these institutions out of the way. Another thing we're looking at is the baby boom generation is retiring, what economists are calling the silver tsunami, because millions of business owners who have small firms of 50 or 100 or 200, 500 people that are family owned, they're going to be retiring, and they don't have family members to pass the business on to. The kids moved away. They don't want to come back to Ohio and run the manufacturing plant. And literally millions and millions and millions of jobs in the United States are on the chopping block in the next decade. And if the business owner sells that business to private equity or to a competitor, what inevitably will happen, and we've seen it constantly in the last decades, is a lot of people are going to lose their jobs as these larger companies come in and chop up these littler firms. But you can sell that company to a trust on behalf of the workers, the employees of the company, and literally create an employee-owned company or a worker cooperative. And for the owner who is selling, there are tax advantages. So that's another way to use the existing system to advance a more democratic workplace where people will end up having better wages, more participation. The companies are more resilient during times of financial crisis. And the book is filled with these kinds of examples of ways this is acting out all over the country at this time.
Right. The first thing people need to know is that it's possible, to know that it's out there. And before they have to form the idea that, we can save this company. We don't have to just be looking for work somewhere else.
Well, that's exactly right. It's too often what we're good at is saying what we're against. And of course, I could talk for hours about the extractive economy and to use a word that has been used in a different saying, the carnage that's being wreaked on families and communities and workers and so forth. But the powerful thing is to say, what are we for? What is the vision of a democratic economy? How do we create jobs in communities that are anchored in place? How do we leverage existing assets like universities and hospitals that purchase billions of dollars of goods and services and direct that money into the local community that in a way that benefits the institution but creates more economic opportunity in the community? How do we control land speculation that's driving so many people out of our cities because they can't afford to live there through mechanisms like community land trusts? How do we ensure that communities like Cleveland, Ohio, where I happen to be today, which always is having to negotiate with the large major banks in the United States to try to get loans and often can't get those loans, how do we set up a public bank here so that the city and the community can control its own source of capital to be deployed for local community benefiting purposes. So all of these things are not only possible, but they're actually playing out in communities all over the United States right now.
I write a lot of articles, and I always try to conclude with a solution because you read so many things about what's wrong. But the question is, okay, but what do we do about it? How do we get out of it? And I think that's where the strength of the public banking movement came from. At first, we had Occupy Wall Street, which pointed the finger at what is wrong. It was not that homeowners or people were signing up for homes that they couldn't really afford. It was the subprime people that were getting blamed, and Occupy Wall Street pointed the finger at the Wall Street banks themselves. They were engaged in fraud at many different levels. And then there was the Standing Rock protests, which sort of organized people, got people together, and then they did the divestment movement where they wanted to pull their cities' money, not just their own money, but the money, their public monies, the monies of cities and states out of Wall Street. But then the question was, okay, but so who's going to do our banking? We don't have any alternative but the big Wall Street banks for our big government money. So then public banking was the obvious answer, and that's why it's taken off lately, because it's really solution-focused.
You know, I just love the way you told that tale, because that's really how change is made. There's this process that leads to certain kinds of solutions and answers, and you've just sort of laid out in a nutshell how public banking, really became as powerful an idea as it is. And I was just a couple of weeks ago, I was in the United Kingdom for a few weeks, and there were I was told in 18 different communities in a country, it's not that very big, public banks are in the process of being set up. So it's a beautiful story right there. A lot of people think a myth that we have in this economy is, really working people can't really run their own companies. You need the really smart people and the people with the business degrees from Stanford and so forth and Harvard. And everybody's got to have an MBA, and then everybody has to work for this person. Well, there are millions of people, most people don't know this, millions of American workers, up to 10 million, who are currently working in employee-owned firms or worker cooperatives that are much more democratic, where people are making decisions over their businesses. I helped start in Cleveland a network of for-profit worker-owned cooperatives. The brand name is Evergreen. It's now employing about 250 or so citizens of Cleveland. Most of them were unemployed. We targeted hiring those who are most in need of jobs. Many of them were formerly incarcerated, so it becomes very difficult for people to get jobs. We created these companies linked to the supply chain of the big hospitals and universities and so forth. And what we have is a network of for-profit companies that are owned by the workers, that are turning a profit. People are getting living wages, family supporting salaries. They're getting health benefits. They're getting profit sharing. They're electing members to the board of directors of the company. People who were incarcerated 10 years are now moving up to become supervisors. I mean, that's, the idea of a more democratic economy and kind of workplace and a very different economy, it's not just a theoretical possibility or a distant utopia, but it's already under construction in the real world, in our country. And this is really to tell that story and shine a light on it is why Marjorie Kelly and I wrote The Making of a Democratic Economy. It's real, it's here, it's
that's
now.
Great. Those stories do need to be told. They're so inspiring. That makes me think of another benefit of the 2008-2009 crisis with the quantitative easing, where the Federal Reserve had been creating money in open market operations for a long time. It's something they're allowed to do, and they had done it on a small scale. But then they all of a sudden did it on a big scale, and people said, can they do that? They can't really do that. But there was no way to stop them. They just did it. So now we know that they can create trillions of dollars, and it's not creating hyperinflation. And the Japanese and the Chinese have Well, the Chinese have increased their money supply by a factor of 18 over the last 20 years, and they still only have 2% inflation, or they did right up till last December. But anyway, they haven't had runaway inflation, although they just keep pumping money into the system with their fiscal policies, and so is Japan. Anyway, we now know that these things can be done, so I think quantitative easing is liable to take off as a way to fund the real economy, just as these other things that we thought couldn't be done have taken off.
I completely agree with you. And you know what? Something like quantitative easing shows, I don't know if you remember 15 years ago or something, there was a very famous series of movies called The Matrix with Keanu Reeves. And everybody looked out the world, and it just, they were going to work and everything like that. Well, it turned out that was all a sort of shroud that these machines had created, and people were really enslaved, and all this whole story. Anyway, it's a little bit like we're living in the Matrix in terms of our economy. And we need to sort of delegitimize it and demythologize it. Things people just take for granted because they've been sold. Like, we have to run the federal budget like we run our household budget, so it always needs to balance. Or a rising tide lifts all boats. Or trickle-down economics actually works. I mean, these are things that are in the air that a lot of people believe about the economy, but there literally is no basis for them. It's just what we've been told. So part of the project, I think, of building a democratic economy is not only lifting up, building and then lifting up these democratic models of workplaces and economic development strategies and public banks and all that to show that this is real. And it's not only building a movement among people to really start to demand that the principles of democracy be brought to the economy, because we're the ones creating that economy, but also we need to look out at the current economy and challenge the sort of pablum that we're being given about how it works, because it simply doesn't work that way. If this were the greatest economy in the history of the world, as the president's fond of saying, why is the life expectancy of white males declining for the first time in anyone's memory? Why are so many of our children not going to be able to achieve a greater economic status than we are? Why are we all falling back? So, yes, the economy may be growing by a certain metric, but it's not serving our need.
Right. And you point out that shareholders, on the shareholder model, shareholders that only own this stock for like 5 minutes, right, they have no interest in the company at all. They're only, that is what financialization is. They're just gambling. They buy low and hope to sell it to the greater fool at something higher. And they are the ones that have the ability to make decisions for the corporation. And in fact, you have these hostile takeovers where they come in and buy it up and make very bad decisions for the corporation, like borrowing tons of money to pay dividends or whatever to buy out the stock, and then imposing the debt on the business, and then running it into bankruptcy, selling off the assets or whatever. So clearly, it's a better model to let the workers localized in that area and the people run it who are in that area.
We will continue this conversation with the Democracy Collaborative's Ted Howard and Ellen next time, as they discuss Ted's new book, which is co-authored by Marjorie Kelly, called The Making of a Democratic Economy. Marjorie Kelly is also the author of The Divine Right of Capital and Owning Our Future, and both of these books are available from the democracycollaborative.org. At the outset of this program, we heard Ted Howard tell Ellen that what we need in this country now is a sort of revolutionary grassroots movement that will reclaim the democratic power to determine who our country belongs to, the people or the private bankers. That sort of movement is exactly what took place 100 years ago in North Dakota, when continental America's only publicly owned bank, the Bank of North Dakota, got its start. It's become a paragon of purposeful economic partnering and profitability. It's 100 years old exactly on July 28th. And it's interesting to note that it got started within 90 days after the enabling legislation was passed. So it's appropriate and helpful to take a short look at how that democratically driven institution got its start and what it dealt with along the way. In previous programs here, we've been discussing with the bank's centennial historian, Mike Jacobs, the many very interesting side stories associated with this historic development. We'll return to those side stories individually in future programs, but today we've asked Mike to share an overview op-ed that he wrote for the occasion in the newspaper that he used to serve as editor-in-chief, the Grand Forks Herald.
From the beginning of my research for a centennial history of the Bank of North Dakota, the question has been, how can a state so conservative, so very deeply red, establish, sustain, and grow a state-owned bank? It's a complicated question. Certainly, it's not because North Dakotans rushed off to embrace socialism, as the publisher of the Herald warned at the time, and ideologues and historians still sometimes suggest. State ownership is the definition of socialism, and the bank is owned by the state. The idea of the bank may have come from activists who were familiar with socialist ideology. These included Arthur C. Townley, who founded the Nonpartisan League, the farmers' movement that swept to power in 1916, and shortly established what it called the Industrial Program. The phrase has a Soviet smell to it, but the League presented it as an economic development plan. Townley himself had been a Socialist Party organizer, but the party and the man were not loyal to each other. When Townley began organizing the League, the Socialist Party expelled him. A number of League insiders were socialists, but League leaders rejected their ideas about governing the state-owned businesses. Nor were North Dakota voters attracted to the Socialist Party itself. Its best showing in a statewide election was 8% of the vote for president in 1912. Townley was undoubtedly sincere in his desire to make change. He made sacrifices for the League, but he is better understood as a disgruntled entrepreneur than as an ideological socialist. He took the organizing job after his flax farm failed, and as a League leader, he invested its funds in a number of schemes that had little to do with its program. One of his enterprises, the U.S. Sissel Trust, is examined in detail in the current issue of North Dakota History, published by the State Historical Society. Other Leaguers also had business interests. William Lemke, who wrote the legislation creating the bank, had invested heavily in land in Mexico. He involved a number of others in the scheme, including William Langer, initially the League's Attorney General, but later a vocal foe of the early League. In 1928, Langer resurrected the League as a personal political machine, but by that time the League was less interested in economic development than it was in farm relief. Langer's reputation stems from that era, not from his career with the initial NPL government. One real socialist among the Leaguers was Henry Martinson, star of a film about the League's rise called Northern Lights. Martinson served as Assistant State Labor Commissioner for many years, and he never abandoned his faith in what he called the revolution. The North Dakotans who voted for the League were interested in practical solutions to pressing problems, and the League provided one in a state-owned bank. This wasn't an original idea. The fledgling American Republic had a national bank, and in the 20th century, the Federal Reserve System was established. A number of states experimented with state-owned banks. These failed for various reasons. The idea of public banking was in the air, and in North Dakota, the idea took root. Conditions favored the North Dakota Bank, and the bank responded to a real need for capitalism in a developing economy, and its mission statement emphasized economic development. That hasn't changed. Almost a fourth of North Dakotans were immigrants when the League came to power, and many of them were familiar with cooperatives, credit unions, and even public banks. Some of its statewide candidates were University of North Dakota graduates who came in contact with progressive ideas on the campus. The adoption of initiative and referendum statewide aided the League, just as recall brought an end to its power in the state, though not to the institutions it developed. In the 1921 recall election, voters approved the bank but removed the League officials. the winning gubernatorial candidate vowed to continue the bank. The real catalyst, however, was a dysfunctional private banking system. The state had far too many privately owned banks, more than 800 of them in 1920, in a population of about 500,000. Many of them were seriously undercapitalized, and all of them were dependent on Twin Cities banks. At the same time, milling and transportation interests preyed on the state's farmers. A long effort to establish a state-owned terminal elevator failed, and frustrated farmers took matters in their own hands, accepting a program to develop the state's economy by using the state's own financial resources. Thus, the bank was born, and it has survived election challenges and court cases to reach its 100th anniversary. The bank opened for business on July 28, 1919, and a celebration of its 100th year will take place in Bismarck on Monday, July 29th.
That's Mike Jacobs, historian for the Bank of North Dakota's centennial celebration and author of the centenary book, The Bank of North Dakota, From Surviving to Thriving, The First 100 Years. It's an excellent piece filled with great stories and photographs, and it can be obtained from the Bank of North Dakota's website, through your local booksellers, or online. I'd add that the Centenary's online material is particularly interesting and can be found at the bndstory.nd.gov. That's the Bank of North Dakota's website, bnd.nd.gov. We send our hearty congratulations to the leaders and the people of North Dakota who have stayed the course with this bank for all these years and which now inspires an entire nation with its efficiencies, successes, and contributions to the great state of North Dakota. We intend to follow its lead in reclaiming our own democratic power to create banks that serve the public interest. Well, that's it for this edition of It's Our Money with Ellen Brown. Our thanks to our guests, our sponsor, Public Banking Associates, and to you for listening. Be sure to check out Ellen's latest writings on the economy and the changing world of money by visiting ellenbrown.com. And for more information on public banking, visit publicbankinginstitute.org. For information on how local and state government leaders can obtain professional insight and counsel about public banks from key national experts, visit publicbankingassociates.com. I'm Walt McCree. See you next time on It's Our Money with Ellen Brown.